Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Over the past 29 years, disease-modifying medications have transformed MS treatment. But for some people living with MS, these medications are increasingly out of reach because they're simply unaffordable. The National MS Society, along with MS activists, has spent years working tirelessly to change public policy to make these important and necessary medications more available to more people. And today, we're celebrating the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law in August and includes provisions that might improve patient access to high-priced prescription drugs. Steffany Stern, the Vice President of Advocacy for the National MS Society, and Judy Wilson, an MS activist, are joining us today to talk about how this legislation is going to impact people living with MS. Welcome, Steffany and Judy. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, John, for inviting us. It's great to be here.
Steffany, tell me, how has the market changed since disease-modifying medications first became available?
It has changed quite a lot. I think the bottom line is that the price of the MS disease-modifying therapies, which we sometimes call DMTs, the prices have dramatically risen since the first MS disease-modifying therapy came onto the market in 1993. And, you might remember when the first drug came to market, the price range was $8,000 to $11,000 for 1 year of treatment. But as of this year, in February 2022, the median annual price of the MS drugs was almost $94,000. So that's a big increase. 6 of the drugs have gone up by more than 200% since they came on the market. 9 of them are priced at over $100,000. So, right off the bat, you can say these prices and that kind of increases are unsustainable. And those are not the only medications that people with MS take. As you pointed out, these medications have been just transformational for people with MS. My mom was diagnosed in 1981, and there were no treatments at all then. And now we have over 20. But, these medications must be affordable if they're going to make a difference in people's lives.
So tell me, how has this price escalation impacted people with MS in terms of their health insurance?
It's a great question. So as the prices of these MS drugs has increased, we have seen that the health plans, the insurance companies, and pharmacy benefit managers, they are putting forward more and more hurdles for people to access their drugs. So they use tools that the audience is probably very familiar with, people in the audience, prior authorization, step therapy, restricted formularies. It can be really difficult to navigate for the people who are doing the prescribing, the doctors, and for people with MS. And it means a lot of times people are just delayed in getting their treatment, or they're even, it's totally disrupted. So, and then, in addition, people with MS have been paying more and more and more out of pocket for their medications, because as a result of the drug prices going up, the insurance companies have been passing along more costs to the patient or the person with MS.
So with these steep price increases and the health coverage restrictions, Steffany, how are people able to afford their medications?
Okay. Well, a key piece of this, the puzzle, the prescription drug access puzzle for a lot of people with MS comes in the form of patient assistance funding. About 70% of people with MS have relied on these patient assistance programs at one point or another to stay on their drug. But people are very challenged when they transition to Medicare because the patient assistance programs from the drug companies are not allowed in Medicare. And there are these charitable foundations that people can apply for, but it's really hard to get into them. Other people, make a lot of sacrifices. They're doing whatever they can to try to afford their medication. And then, in fact, the sad reality is that not everyone is able to afford their medications or even stay on them and take them as prescribed. And even the patient assistance that some people are able to get, it's just a Band-Aid for a very broken system. And the real problem is the price of the medications and the cost burdens for people with MS.
Judy, you've been living with MS for 12 years, and you've been working alongside the National MS Society for many years, advocating for lower medication costs. Can you tell us about your experience with disease-modifying medications and how the high prices might have impacted you and your treatment over the years?
Sure. I went through a number of medications, actually, over my experience. I was diagnosed in 2010. I was first diagnosed, and I had a few options, but they were all injections. So I wasn't too happy about that, but there were 3 disease-modifying drugs available at the time. And so I picked one for relapsing remitting MS. The first one was Avonex, and those were injections once a week. And I started those. It was $32,000 a year for that drug at that time. Then in March of 2013, I got real excited because there was a new disease-modifying drug out called Tecfidera, and it was a pill. And I was so excited. I thought, oh boy, I need to take injections anymore. So I was like first in line. I couldn't wait to get this drug. So I took the drug for 1 year. That drug was $54,000 a year in 2013. And I took that drug for 1 year, but I had adverse reaction to it. So sadly, I had to go back to injections. I went back to Copaxone, and it was $72,000 a year. So you can see the progression of costs. We started out at 32, now we're at 72 for a medication, a disease-modifying medication. So after I transitioned into Medicare, I thought, oh, I'll go to assistance with a foundation to see if I could get my copay taken care of. Because what happens is the first 2 months, you have to pay close to $5,000, and you have to have $5,000 to pay for that. So what happened is that they my experience was that it was $7,000 to pay for my medications over the year, and that was just for the disease-modifying drug. So that was my experience.
Well, I know that the Society conducted a survey in 2019, the Access to Medication Survey. More than half the respondents said they were concerned about being able to afford their MS medications, and 40% had altered the use of their MS medications due to the cost. That includes stopping, skipping, or delaying treatment. So, Judy, tell me a little bit about your experience as you continued your treatment and perhaps the experience of others whom you may know that went through all the hoops we need to jump through.
Well, basically what happened is that because of the lack of copay assistance, I went off my medication. And I'm taking a risk. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. There's mobility or cognitive issues that could occur. And there's no guarantee about the taking of this risk. So, but the decision was based on money, not medicine. I just simply didn't have the $7,000. And so there were two other, and I've been off my medication, by the way, for a year. So luckily, nothing has happened thus far, but we don't know exactly where I'm going to be at any given time. There are two other people in my group. I'm actually involved in a mentor group for the MS Society as well. And one of them went off and they seem to be stabilized at this point. The other one ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks and is now in an extended care facility. So it's a gamble. Just don't know.
I'm really sorry to hear that you've had to stop treatment. I guess the flip side, the good news here is that passing the Inflation Reduction Act is actually a big win for millions of people across the country. This is the first legislative step designed to improve prescription drug availability. Steffany, can you tell us about this new law and how the National MS Society played a role in making it happen?
Yes. So this is it's a big headline for us and for the country, really. Congress recently passed this law and President Biden signed it into law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and it has within it some of the society's most core priorities for addressing the high burden of drug prices for people with MS who are on Medicare, which is a really significant portion of the MS community. This win reflects years upon years of advocacy by people affected by MS, people sharing their stories and meeting with their legislators and making noise on social media and all kinds of things to call attention to the need for drug pricing reform. And we made an impact on this issue all together, and it is going to have a big effect on the lives of people living with MS. And I know we're going to talk just in a few minutes about the specifics of the law and how does it work, but to sum it up, it is a big deal and it represents change for people with MS. And we did play an important role in the passage of the law. In fact, last week I was invited to the White House along with two other society staff members to a big celebration for the new law in honor of all the years and years of hard work by MS activists.
Judy, what does passing this law mean to you? How might the lives of people living with MS be different under this new law?
Well, I think it really gives people a better opportunity to stay on their disease-modifying drugs. I think that one of the things that the cap, the $2,000 cap per year, that's significant. That means that all of my drugs are a maximum of $2,000. And not only that, but they let you stretch it over the entire year. So I don't have this huge burden, financial burden up front. I can push it out through the entire year, and that's significant. I think it's going to make an enormous difference to a lot of people with MS.
Well, Steffany, as Judy just mentioned, one of the drug pricing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act includes implementing this out-of-pocket cap for Medicare Part D. And we've heard from Sandy. Sandy's wondering how life under this cap will be different than what it is today.
Yes, and I mean, Judy said it well. In a nutshell, the new law is going to have a real life impact of reducing what people with MS pay for their medications. So right now, there is currently no cap on what people on Medicare spend on their medications. And this has been a glaring problem with the Medicare drug coverage benefit for years. As a result, because there's no cap, people with health conditions like MS are paying a lot of money out of their own pocket, and they cannot predict at any given year what they'll end up paying. And Judy, the numbers that Judy gave are an average. The cumulative annual out-of-pocket spending for Medicare beneficiaries with MS, the amount people pay just for their MS drug is about $7,000 a year. But all that's about to change. So people on Medicare, as Judy said, will soon pay no more than $2,000 each year for all their meds together. So that represents thousands of dollars in savings on average for people with MS. And as Judy said, perhaps just as exciting, they are going to be able to spread those costs evenly throughout the year. So they won't have all those costs upfront in January to March that are typically experienced today. And they'll be able to divide up what they owe equally and pay it in those smaller amounts. And they'll have predictability in what they spend in a year, which they just don't have right now. And we know that from conversations with people with MS that the out-of-pocket cap and the smoothing mechanism is going to be a game changer for people who rely on Medicare to get their medications. I do want to flag the out-of-pocket cap doesn't go into effect immediately. It is going to take some time to implement because it's complicated, but it will take effect in January of 2025.
Well, the National MS Society's position is that we can't just pass laws that reform out-of-pocket costs. Congress also has to do something to actually bring down the price of prescription medications. So let's talk about how the bill addresses drug pricing. Steffany, what are inflationary rebates? How do they work and when do they go into effect?
Yes. Okay. So I am going to try to explain this simply, but you have to bear with me because I think this is a hard of kind of a technical piece to explain. But essentially, the goal of these inflationary rebates is to discourage the drug companies from raising the price of their drugs for Medicare faster than inflation. So manufacturers who are raising prices faster than inflation will be required to provide rebates to the government for that amount that's above inflation, the amount of their price increase starting in 2023. Very similar, the government already does this for Medicaid and some other programs. So they already have experience implementing this type of rebate. So this won't reduce drug prices, but will stop prices from increasing as rapidly and as massively as they have in recent years. So this goes into effect right away in October, in a few weeks, for Medicare Part D drugs. And then in 2023 in January for the Part B drugs, which are the infusions and the other doctor-administered medications. So that will be one of the pieces we see very soon.
Part of the new law allows the government, for the first time in history, to negotiate drug prices on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries. Steffany, we heard from Brian, who wants to know how he'll be affected if the prescription drug he takes has a negotiated price.
Yes, let's talk about what does this mean? There's this new drug price negotiation program. It means that government can negotiate the price of some expensive medications the same way that right now private health plans are doing, and then other types of government health insurance are doing already to try to bring down costs for people on Medicare. Not all drugs would be eligible for negotiation. So we want to get that out front. It's a certain number of drugs, 10 drugs the first year, and then 15 more drugs, and then another 15, another 20. So it's not all drugs. It's like a slice of the most costly and burdensome. And there's restrictions. Drugs won't be eligible for negotiation right when they come to market. So drug companies can still recoup some of their costs. But it will be very impactful. Depending on how this plays out, MS medications could be eligible for negotiation, which means their costs could go down. We don't know yet. We anticipate this could affect some of our medications. And as we move down the road and the government is able to negotiate on some of the more blockbuster meds for other health conditions that have been on the market for years, that will pave the way for them to look at these other medications. But it also matters because a lot of times we talked about people with MS are often paying a share or a percentage of the cost of the medication, like co-insurance, like 25% of the cost rather than a flat amount. So the actual price of the medication does have an impact on what people are paying out of their pocket. So we are going to see how this plays out, but it certainly could bring down costs for people depending on what medication they're on and what medications are selected for negotiation.
Steffany, if we look at fairly recent history, we might recall that there were enhanced subsidies that were actually adopted under the American Rescue Plan Act, which was also known as the COVID Relief Bill. And those subsidies really help people to buy coverage in the marketplaces much cheaper than it had been before. Were those enhanced subsidies included in this new law?
Yes, they were. And we absolutely want to give a shout out for these. This is something else that MS activists have been really advocating for, these enhanced subsidies to help people buy coverage in the marketplaces for much cheaper than it was before. So people have been able to go onto the marketplaces, or the exchanges they're called in some states, and they have been able to get coverage that is greatly reduced in price in the last few years. We now have a record high enrollment in these marketplaces, and the country has a record low uninsured rate. The subsidies, these more generous subsidies, were temporary under the COVID plan, as you mentioned. They were supposed to phase out at the end of this year, but Congress extended them an additional 3 years through 2025 in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we are excited about this because we know that making coverage more affordable is very important for people with MS who might find themselves in a health insurance coverage gap for one reason or another. So for example, if they're waiting out the Social Security disability process. So we're very happy to see these extended.
Judy, your story and the stories of so many others are real examples of why reform is so important. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as an MS activist, and maybe let our viewers know how they can get involved?
Well, I've only been an activist essentially for less than a year, but it's been a fantastic ride. It really has. It's been, I feel like I've really made a difference, and I'm excited about that. Basically, I did go to a hearing to talk about the medication costs, the Inflation Reduction Act, and state my concerns. And then after that, I was actually invited back for a celebration with Senator Kelly's office. So that was kind of fun. And I was able to speak to senators and representatives in my area to help them understand what our position is and what our needs are, so that they could be aware of what the MS community has to deal with. And I think that I've been a group leader for about 7 years, and I really love that as well. So being able to get involved in the MS Society and make a difference, both with the group and the individuals that have MS, and also be able to contribute to progression of getting monies and recognition for the MS community is really important to me, and it's been fantastic.
Steffany, where can people find more information about the Inflation Reduction Act and all the details that we've been discussing today?
Sure. So the Society, we have posted a summary of the new law. I think it's very simply called the Inflation Reduction Act timeline on our website. If you go to the advocacy portion of the Society's website, we are also happy to take questions at our general email address, msactivist@nmss.org. We're also going to be looking for all kinds of additional ways to get the word out over the next few months in our newsletters, in our social media, via our navigators, any and all means to get the word out, because we fought so hard for this law, and now we want to make sure that everyone across the MS community is aware of it and aware of what they can expect and the new rights that they have.
Judy, thanks so much for being here today, sharing your experience and choosing to be a voice for the MS community. And Steffany, thank you for helping us better understand the new prescription drug pricing reforms. I'd like to ask each of you what you would say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember. And Steffany, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I think the top takeaway I always want to leave people with is that MS activists like Judy make a difference. So whether you were sharing your story with a legislator or their staff, or making sure that people understand the real life impact of high drug prices, or just being really persistent, this is why we have this new law, and this is why we want people to join us in advocacy work. The second thing I'd say is we want people to know that if you are on Medicare now and you're struggling with your costs, there is hope and it will get better. And if you're not on Medicare right now, but you're a person living with MS and thinking forward to the future and planning for your retirement, this is something that you should familiarize yourself with because it could be meaningful for you as well. And then the third thing I'd say is this new victory is really focused mostly on the needs of people who rely on Medicare for their coverage. And while we know that population has a lot of health related and financial needs, and we care so much about their struggles, we know our work is not done and we must keep going until people with all kinds of different kinds of health coverage can get some relief from the high costs of their medications. So stay tuned for what comes next, and we hope you will join us.
And Judy, how about you? What are your top 3 takeaways?
Well, mine are pretty short and sweet, but I think being an MS person on the move, that's really important, to be involved in the community. Being active in the MS community is really fantastic. Getting to know your fellow MS people, getting to know what is happening in your community. And then being an activist in your local and federal MS healthcare policies, I think is really important as well.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and Judy, Steffany, thank you both for being with us today. Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll see ways for you to get involved, and you'll hear about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Judy and Steffany for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast is going to be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSExpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Steffany Stern, Judy Wilson, and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.